Question number one. What is the Rebbe's view on Zionism, the Israeli flag, the Magen David, all in the same category, etc.?
So there's Zionism, the Israeli flag, and the Magen David.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with the Magen David. I'm going to do it backwards. The Magen David is an ancient symbol. The Magen David did not start by Theodore Herzl in the 1880s. The Magen David is a symbol which is found in Sfarim. I don't know which. I don't know what's the earliest origin of the Magen David. But apparently there is a basis for the Magen David in geometry, and there's a basis of Magen David in Kabbalah. I'm going to tell you a very interesting story. It's a real story. The Rebbe's mother tells the story, and they now found the same story from the previous Rebbe as well. The story is that one year on Simchas Torah, maybe it was Pevav, one year on Simchas Torah in Leningrad, the Frierdiker Rebbe Shul, a professor walked in, a professor. So this guy shows up in Shul by the Frierdiker Rebbe in Leningrad, a professor, and he wants to see the Rebbe on Yom Tov. So it was a bit of a disturbance. The Rebbe didn't know who he was. Of course, the big concern the Rebbe had was that he was an agent of the government and the KGB, and that he had some kind of sinister motivation. So the Rebbe couldn't ignore him. He couldn't tell him go. And he had to sort of, until he figured out who he was and what his motivations actually were, he had to treat him with kid gloves. The end of the story was that this man was actually hired by the Soviet government to do research into matters of the occult, Kabbalah and astrology and so on and so forth. And they paid him the way they paid everybody else, as they say in the mafia, with 6 ounces of lead. They killed him, they executed him later on, because that's what Stalin did. He used you, and then when you knew too much, because you helped him, then he had to put you away and replace you with somebody else. He was actually working for the government. He was commissioned by the government, but there was nothing sinister about it. Forget it. They were not trying to hurt the Frierdiker Rebbe. They actually wanted the Frierdiker Rebbe's help in this project. And this man himself, didn't understand the implications of the Frierdiker Rebbe and the work that he was doing, and the way the government saw the Frierdiker Rebbe as one of the great enemies of the state, and so forth. So he shows up Yom Tov, wants to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was obviously busy with Hasidim. The Rebbe made a minute or two to speak to him, and he told him that today's not a good day, come back tomorrow. And when he came back the following day or two, the Rebbe gave him his time, and he told the Rebbe that he's doing research on Kabbalah and astrology and a lot of Eastern ideas, occultish kind of ideas, and he's particularly interested in the Magen David. And he wants information explaining the Magen David based on astrology, geometry, which is a math, which is a real science, and Kabbalah. So the Frierdiker Rebbe tried to get out of it. He says, listen, this is not my business. I'm not into theoretical research. I'm into Afatz Yados. I'm into spreading Yiddishkeit, and I'm not into just theoretical studies. So this man said to the Rebbe that he understands that the Rebbe is versteht in Kabbalah, is an expert in Kabbalah, and he should contribute to this effort. So when the Rebbe realized he can't get away from this man, he told him, I'll put you in touch with my Sara Haskala, I'll put you in touch with my Minister of Information. Who was the Frierdiker Rebbe Sara Haskala? Our Rebbe. In 1925, 1926, the Rebbe was either 23 or 24 years old. He was relatively young. But the Rebbe, the Rebbe's father said that to Bar Mitzvah, the Rebbe was a Goan Olam. To the Bar Mitzvah, he was a Goan Olam. And the Rebbe commissioned him to write a report explaining the Magen David according to astrology, geometry, and Kabbalah. And the Rebbe's mother said that for 3 months, in the bathroom in their home, the Rebbe had a big fat book of mathematics, geometry, and the Rebbe wrote an entire report in Russian explaining the Magen David according to Kabbalah, according to geometry, and according to astrology. Now I would argue that report is extant. It was not. It probably is someplace in some office in Russia, and one day it'll show up. I don't know how much of the Rebbe's name is going to be written on it, but it'll be the Rebbe's handwriting. The Rebbe wrote an extensive essay. When the Rebbe completed it, and he sent it off to this professor, so then the Frierdiker Rebbe said, this is brought in Hayem Yem, that the Rebbe is Sar HaSkola Shali, he's my minister of information, and this guy sent the Rebbe a lot of money. He sent the Rebbe a chunk of geld for the effort that he put in. The Frierdiker Rebbe got the money, and the same day he sent it back. He didn't want to touch it. He was so afraid. When the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested, one of the series of questions that they asked him, which are in the published cross-examinations, was, what do you know about this professor and his research? And I understand that he sent you money. I understand that he sent you money. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, I don't know anything about him. He asked me for help. I provided him the help. He sent me the money. I sent the money right back. In other words, I didn't know what his source was. I did back. This is just an interesting story. The Rebbe's mother told the story many years ago. In the Frierdiker Rebbe's version of it was only discovered when the Frierdiker Rebbe's cross-examination file was given out by the government of Russia, which is about 30 years ago, 31 years ago. They gave out all the files, and you could see that the KGB asked him questions about this as well. The point of this whole thing is the Magen David is legitimate. There's something about the 6-pointed star as opposed to the 5-pointed star, right? The typical star has 5 points. The Magen David is 2 triangles, juxtaposed on top of one another in opposite directions. It's 2 triangles. It's 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. And there is a lot of Torah and Kabbalah attached to it. I don't know what that is. I mean, obviously, somehow it corresponds to, in Kabbalah, there's a concept called Yud Beis Guli Alachsan. The 12 edges of the crooked lines. There are 6 lines that go across on an angle. Each line that goes across on an angle has 2 edges, called Yud Beis Guli Alachsan. And it's Api Kabbalah, it's the Chitzonius of Zoh. So maybe it's connected to that, but I don't know. I've never seen it. I've seen Sfarim that are pretty old talk on the Magen David, but I want to say at the outset, I want to confirm that the Magen David has legitimacy in Torah, not just in Zionism. The Zionists took the Magen David and they put it in their flag, which they made out of the color blue and the color white. The choice of colors of blue and white, I don't know where that comes from. I don't know how that plays out in Torah.
I think it's from the blue tzitzis.
It's the wrong blue.
That's what
The blue of the tzitzis is navy. It's a dark blue. It's almost a black. And the blue in the flag of Eretz Yisrael is a sky blue, is a light blue. But the Magen David has a Makav Shadish in Torah. Now, as far as Zionism goes, I would like to give you a philosophical constant, a sheet of Imizot. I don't mind if you question me. I don't even mind if you disagree with me. I just need you to let me finish the thought. That I have to present something to you as a complete thought. And then you can argue with me. It just happens that this Shabbos, either this Shabbos or last Shabbos, someone mentioned to me that in Israel, Bennett, who's Bennett? What's Bennett's role? He's the Prime Minister. It's good that I know the Prime Minister of Israel is, right? The Prime Minister of Israel is Biden. Yes, Saidem and Sayenem. But Bennett spoke on, I guess, on Yom Ha'atzmaut. And he said something which warranted a response from the Bezdin of Rabbani Chabad in Eretz Yisrael. Basically what he said was that when the idea of Zionism was founded by Theodor Herzl in the 1880s, the rabbis came out against it. And he mentioned some rabbis by name. He did not mention the Rebbe Rashab by name, but he referenced some of the Rebbe Rashab's statements about Zionism. And he made the point that they were all wrong and Herzl was right. V'haraya, Zionism is here and Zionism is standing and tepepepepe. So the Rabbani Chabad in Eretz Yisrael made a macha. They objected. The language was there's hip chavod Torah. It's not respectful to speak about the Rabbanim this way. But to be very blunt, man's right. If you look at it with Fleischer Eugen, if you look at it bechitzonius, the Fruma have been wrong on every issue, and the Freie have been right on every issue, going back more than 100 years. Zionism is only the first. And if you know the history of the pre-war years, you can really, really put yourself into a very, very narrow space. I don't know if you guys know this, that Jabotinsky, who was a right-winger and a big Zionist, he ran all over Europe and said, get out of Europe, there's going to be a Holocaust. And he begged Yidden to leave. And the Groise Tzaddikim, the Groise Rebbe said, Chas Hashem, don't leave Europe, and so you're going to become frei, and they died. A Yid hat mir gesagt that in California, many years ago, maybe 30, 40 years ago, there was an old Polish Yidl who was a multi-millionaire. He had given like $350 million to then, in the 1980s, as a grant to some university. And one of the shluchim found out about that Polish Yid. So he brought Rabbi Reichik to see him, to solicit funds for Chabad. And as soon as they walked north, he said, "The Frimme!" He started screaming, "The Frimme! The Frimme! The Frum! If not for the Frum, you know how many Jews will be alive?" And he kicked them out of the office. There are a number of very painful events that have occurred. Let's put a date on it, 1890. You want to broaden it, say 1880. Where if you look at it in the Astachten, the Frume, including our Rabbeim, were wrong, and the Freie and their approaches have so far at least been vindicated. They look right. So this is an unpleasantness as it were. So I want to explain to you the sheet of the Rabbeim, and I want to explain to you how I think our Rabbeim see this in terms of history. There is a huge debate in the Jewish world, and this debate does not exist in the Jewish world, it exists in the Frum world. Okay? Are all Jewish leaders rabbis? To be a Jewish leader, do you need to be a Rav, or a Gadol B'Yisrael, or a Rebbe? So this is a division, this is a dispute, which you find in the Haredi world, in the Frum world. Okay, and again, if you know the history of the last 100 years, like I said, 1890 would be 130 years, one of the places within the Frum world where this question played itself out is in an organization which is very powerful today, maybe the most powerful Frum body in the world, which is called Agudas Yisrael, or called Aguda. The Rebbe Rashab founded Agudas Yisrael. The co-founder of Agudas Yisrael with the Rebbe Rashab was Chaim Brisk, Chaim Soloveitchik Brisk. They made the Aguda and they left the Aguda. They both left the Aguda. The Rebbe Rashab leaving the Aguda, Reb Chaim leaving the Aguda, is part of the reason Lubavitch is so hated in the Frum world. Because the established Frum world is Agudas Yisrael. The only other significant group of Haredi Jews that is among the Aguda is Satmar. Which is why when I was growing up, Satmar and Lubavitch were best buddies. Belz is in the Aguda, Ger is in the Aguda, Visions is in the Aguda, every other Chassid is in the Aguda, all the Greis Litvish Rabbanim are all in the Aguda, and they don't forgive us for leaving the Aguda. It's considered a big scar. And when the Rebbe Rashab left, the Chafetz Chaim was involved in the Aguda, he supported the Aguda. The Chafetz Chaim was Gadol Sheba Gedolim, and all the other Gedolei Yisrael, most of them supported the Aguda. The Rebbe Rashab left, and Chaim Brisker left. What was the issue? The issue was Agudas Yisrael had what they called lay leadership. Agudas Yisrael appointed two bodies of leaders, rabbis and professionals, what we would call today politicians, people like Moshe Sherer, who's now long deceased. But he was the head of Aguda in America for many, many years. Moshe Sherer was a Rav officially, he was clean shaven. Moshe Sherer's role in the Aguda was not because he was such a big Talmid Chacham, although I understand that you can't learn it, it was because he was a politician, he understood diplomacy and politics. The Rabbeim of Chabad held that there is no such thing as Jewish leadership that's not coming directly from Torah. Now you hear this and you may feel that it's closed-minded, and it is. I'm not going to lie to you. But my job is not to convince you that they're right. My job is to give you the facts as they are. The Rebbeim of Chabad, the Rebbe Rashab was at the spearhead of this. When there was this whole question of how Jews in general, and Frum Jews in particular, are going to preserve themselves and keep themselves against non-Jewish anti-Semitism, and of course what's much more sinister and severe, Jewish anti-Semitism. So the Aguda was a political party. In Poland there were quite a few seats in the Polish Sejm which belonged to members of the Aguda. In Latvia there was people who sat in the government. They were senators, the equivalent of senators. You have what's called a parliamentary system, like you have in England, like you have in Israel, not like we have in this country. And Jews, members of Agudas Yisrael, sat in the governments of Goyish countries. Now in Israel, the parliament has 120 seats. It's a constant. They never change the number of seats. Aguda has, I don't know how many seats, 3 seats, 4 seats, 5 seats. They represent a certain percentage of the Israel belong to Aguda. We, Chabad, was told by the Rebbe always to vote for the Frumist party. We don't belong to any party, which means we lose from Malazite. But the Rebbe said we should not be in the government, because being in the government means you have to collaborate in Yad Ha'Hepech HaHalacha. but that chas v'shalom a vote should go to waste. The Rebbe said any vote that's wasted in Israel can bring pekuach nefesh b'gash. You have to vote, and the position of the Rebbe was you have to vote for the Reformist Party. So Aguda takes for granted that they have the Chabad vote. Now I understand that within Chabad there's a split. Some Chabad, and I'm not an Israeli and I don't understand Israeli politics. I'm not a political person. I believe that we should vote for Aguda. The Rebbe's position was to vote for the Reformist Party. Aguda is the Reformist Party today. But there are a lot of people who say that you can't vote for Aguda, you have to vote for the party that's most strong on the issue of Shleimus Haaretz, of land for peace. Because that's Pekuach Nefesh, and Pekuach Nefesh, so within Chabad there's a split. So that's why some of the great Hasidic Rebbes, like the Gerer Rebbe, don't like us so much anymore, because even though we're not in the Aguda, but they knew they always had our votes. Since Gimel Tammuz, there's a big split within Chabad. I think that Rabbonim of Chabad, who have more power in Israel than in other places, as a body, support that Lubavitch Chassidim should vote for Aguda, but I don't know if everybody does. Okay, Agudas Yisrael is a frum political party that had rabbis, rabbinic leadership, clergy, and lay leadership. The Rebbe Rashab held there's no such thing as a leader that's not a Rebbe, a Rav, a Gadol Yisrael. It's a very narrow position. The alternative way to say this, to say this in different words, and this is something that you really have to contemplate and consider. The other way to say it is, there is nothing Jewish that's not religious, period. The meaning of the word Jew is religious. The reality of Jews is a religious reality. The idea of a secular Jew, or the idea that there's a parochial, which means a secular part of a religious life of a Jew, is not recognized by our Rabbeim and by the Soloveitchiks, by the B'chaim. The most hard-headed Misnagdim were with us on this issue. This is the position. So, what's the story of Zionism? The story of Zionism is the same story, the story of the Reform. People don't know the history, and not that history matters that much, but people don't know the history. What is the history of the Reform? What's the root of Reform? The Reform movement is 300 years old. The Zionist movement is about 130, 140 years old, right? What's the root of the Reform movement? The history of the Reform movement is anti-Semitism. The founders of the Reform, the fathers of the Reform movement felt that if Jews would not be as different from their neighbors as they were, their neighbors would hate them less. It was a philosophy. Their quote, their code, their MO, their modus operandi, their philosophy revolved around the statement, Tihi Yehudi b'veisecha ba'adam b'teisecha. Be a Jew at home and a mensch in the street. Do not flaunt your Judaism. In Germany, you didn't want to wear a yarmulke. Not you didn't have to. You didn't want to. And it was considered being a good Jew. You wanted to dress like a German. If the Germans were clean-shaven, you were clean-shaven. You certainly spoke German. You joined the German army. You participated in political processes. You wanted to be as German as possible with the belief that if Jews would be German enough, the Germans are hating them. Now, first of all, within one generation, two for sure, this movement, which was meant to protect Jews, created one of the most massive events of the frying out of Jews any time in our history. In a very, very short time. One of my children, one of my sons is a very intelligent boy. Moshe Mendelssohn, the founder of the Reform movement, was probably a frum man. Rabbi Heller says he was modern Orthodox. Moshe Mendelssohn's children were baptized. Not his grandchildren, not his grandchildren, his own sons became Christians. And he was a god. Moshe Mendelssohn was an incredible genius in Torah and Lahav and other Chochmas. His vision was that Jews should be more German so they should be able to preserve themselves. And of course the cliche is, you've heard this from many people before, and I've said it many times before, what was the schar we got for trying to be good Germans so the Germans wouldn't hate us as much? The gas chamber. You know, and the Europeans in Germany, they used to say that there's the Ostjud and the Wustjud, you know? The Eastern Jew and the Western Jew. The Ust Jew was the Jew from Russia and Poland who had a beard and wore a long coat, and he usually was poor, and his clothing was dirty, and he was unclean, and he smelled. And of course he was The Wust Jew, the Western Jew, was French or British or German or Scandinavian. He was really not frum. They had these big, beautiful temples. The first thing they brought into those temples, almost the very beginning, was the organ, Rachmana litzlan, which is a musical instrument, because the church had the organ. The Jews wanted to make their shul look like the church. That movement was a response to anti-Semitism. The philosophy of the movement was assimilation. Be as non-distinct, be as non-different as your neighbors. Theodor Herzl lived in the 1880s. Theodor Herzl was Theodor Herzl was a reporter. That was his thing. He was a newspaper reporter. And in the 1880s, there was a famous Dreyfus affair where in France, a Jew was accused of killing some kind of officer in the army, and they were going to destroy him. And the whole thing was anti-Semitic. Dreyfus was not a frum Jew at all. He was a totally secular Jew. Meaning he was a good reformer. He belonged to the segment of the Jewish people who, for the purposes of anti-Semitism, decided to assimilate, and guess what? They hung him out to dry. They tried to destroy him. Herzl was a reporter on that case. He witnessed the Dreyfus affair. He saw how unfair it was. He saw that he was living in France and thinking, I'm a Frenchman like anybody else. I'm like Jews in America, secular Jews in America. They don't see themselves as separate. They're Americans. And in Germany, Jews saw themselves as Germans first and Jews separate. Second, and when in France, which is a modern country and a Western country and a democratic country with a legal system which provided protection for individual rights and equal rights, when you see such blatant anti-Semitism by the people who are supposed to protect the law of the land, so Herzl got a wake-up call. Herzl realized that the reform approach to anti-Semitism failed. The idea that we're going to avoid anti-Semitism by being like the Goy has broken down. The Goy will always see us as different. So Herzl took the exact opposite approach. Zionism is a philosophy that in the 1890s, in the 1880s and 1890s, really until the Second World War, was quite popular and quite respectable. It's called nationalism. Nationalism is the exact opposite of the reform. Because the philosophy of the reform is melt, be as much like your neighbor as possible. Nationalism says a Jewish state, Jewish pride, Jewish strength, Jewish power, Jewish army, Jewish defense. The whole idea of nationalism, we have our own country with our own borders, and we're going to have our own police and our own prisons and our own criminals and and we'll be able to defend ourselves like any other nation. This was the philosophy. So in a real way, Zionism and the Reform movement, which are the two largest brain children that are against the Torah in the last 300 years, their base is the same thing, to counteract anti-Semitism, but their approaches are very opposite. Reform's approach was thinking that if I'll be enough like the Goy won't see me as different, and that failed. So then became the idea of nationalism. Nationalism means I'm going to be a Jew and be proud. And that's where the Hatikva comes from. Hatikva is not a song. The Hatikva is the anthem of a movement with an idea. If Zionism was founded in the 1880s, and Israel was founded in 1948, there was 60 years of Zionism before there was a Jewish state. So they had a Hatikva. Hatikva was a hope. That's what it means. They hoped, they wished, they anticipated, they planned that they're going to have a homeland. Now, if you go back to the early Zionists, you will find the split. Really secular Zionists, like Herzl himself, had absolutely no use for Israel. None at all. It meant nothing to them. Because they were not interested in anything but to do with religion. It was just a nation. Herzl wanted to build a Jewish state in North Africa, in Western Africa, in Ethiopia, Uganda, someplace over there. In West Africa, Uganda. Okay? But there were other Zionists who were not frum, but they had more of a flavor of Yiddishkeit, and they said the Jewish state has to be in the Jewish homeland, the Jewish eternal homeland is Eretz Yisrael. But that's the background of the establishment of the state of Israel. The Rabbeim were against it fire. I want to add one more little kvetch. Before Herzl yet, there was what's called Aliyah Rishonah. There was Zionists before Zionism. In the early 1880s, there was a movement that started in Russia, not in France, which was essentially a Zionist movement. The name of the movement was Bilu, Beis Yud Lamed Vov, and Bilu is an abbreviation for Beis Yaakov V'chuvanelcha, House of Jacob, come let us go. In the early 1880s, there were massive pogroms in Russia. They killed tens of thousands of Jews all over Russia. The Rebbe Maharash chose to fight the pogroms and to stay, but there was talk that the Rebbe Maharash would go to Israel. If the Rebbe Maharash had gone to Israel, the history of the Jewish people would be materially different, because a lot of Yidden would have followed him to Israel. The Rebbe's comment was, if they would have added the last two words in the pasuk, Beis Yaakov l'chu v'necha ba'oir Hashem, in the light of God, he would have joined the movement. You see, it's another illustration. By the Rabbeim, there was no such thing as Jewish and not religious. And the Rabbeim stood on this, insisted on this, sometimes in ways that at the time seemed crazy. Like, what's the big deal? Jews are trying to help one another and you're not going to join because it doesn't say God's name? But the Rabbeim had a very, very clear vision that there's no such thing as Jewish, it's not religious, period, the end, full stop. That was the position. So the Rebbe Marash said if they would have added the two words, Beit Hashem, he would have joined. A few years later, you had the Dreyfus Affair, and then you had Herzl and Zionism, which was very secular. And understand, between 1880 and 1940, 60 years, the Zionist movement was incredibly compelling. It's very, very hard for you to understand the magnetism of the movement. All over Europe and America, you had these clubs, Zionist clubs. And the Zionist clubs had mixed affairs, and they danced the horror, and they sang of an Agila, and they had a good time, they had camps, and they had theater, and they had dance, and they had drama, and they had literature. It was a whole world rich in culture, and they were terribly frei. Terribly frei. And millions of Jews, especially in Poland, between World War I and World War II, a large percentage of Jews who a day before were wearing payas and beards, Chassidish Yidden, became Zionist. It was a magefa. It's really hard to appreciate how many Yidden were drawn into the Zionist idea. Now, of course, in Russia it wasn't called Zionism. It was called Yiddishism, or it was called communism. But also the same idea. There were these new movements, new ideas. They were so cool. They were so hip. They were so much fun. They were so exciting, especially to young people. And they drew people in with a force that's indescribable. And the Rebbeim fought against it. Fought against it to the death. Mamish. Why? So again, you go back to the Rebbe Rashab. The principled reason is because there's no such thing as Jewish, it's not religious. The reality was, and you can see this in our Rebbe's writings, that the Rebbe Rashab used to quote their papers. And we're talking now, more than 100 years ago, way before Artzell was established as a state, where they write that the only reason Jews have Yiddishkeit is because they're amongst the nations of the world. The minute we have our own state, and we have our own nation, we no longer need the Shulchan Aruch, the Tefillin, and the Shabbos, and the Kosher, and the Mikveh, because we have nationalism. In other words, the Zionists said clearly, without equivocating, that their idea is that the state of Israel, the state of Jews, is going to replace the Jewish religion. And the Rabbeim fought against it. And I don't know how to say this nicely. You could make a very good case that they lost. Many Frum Yidden, including great Jews, were swept away by this fever. They became what's called religious Zionists. They believed in the Hatikva, in the hope of having our own homeland. And of course, then the Holocaust happens. One out of every 3 Jews is snuffed out. Israel is born right after the Holocaust. You needed to be a Rebbe of our Rebbe stature, not to say, okay, this is Mashiach. When Israel was established as a state, many people who had for years and years withstood the temptation to be drawn into the Zionist fever fell. It was very common to find Frum Yidden, even Hasidish Yidden, who were either closet Zionists because they didn't want to get lynched, or were open Zionists. They truly believed that Zionism was the beginning of Mashiach, and it was the beginning of a new era for the Jewish people, and so forth and so on. This is the history. Our Rabbeim said, if it's not religious, it's not Jewish, period. Now, the fine line that our Rabbeim walked was, they never made their opposition to the Shitta personal. You know, one of my children, who's like I told you, he's very big a researcher, told me that the Rebbe said, I'll meet with all of them except for the first. The only Israeli Zionist that the Rebbe did not want to meet was David Ben Gurion. David Ben Gurion was an incredible man. He really was. He was the George Washington of the state of Israel, which meant he could have done anything he wanted. He could have been a king in Israel. And just like Washington, the greatest thing he did for the state was step away. Ben Gurion was an incredible man, a powerful man. But the Rebbe saw him as evil, and he was. He was a Rasha Merusha, but he was it's enigmatic. It's hard to figure him out, because if David Gurion was alive today, they wouldn't be talking about giving an inch away. He was a proud Jew. He didn't know what the world said. When Ben Gurion was in charge and the Arabs started up and they killed Arabs, they didn't care what the world said. He was a tough Jew who was very proud. All the appeasing started when he ran out and left the government. But the Rebbe wouldn't see him. The Rebbe felt that he was, the Rebbe said about Ben Gurion, the Rebbe saw him as an evil man. But aside from Ben Gurion, the Rebbe was ready to meet all of them. There's a rumor that the Rebbe was supposed to meet Golda Meir, and because of some real stupid fluke, it didn't happen. And had the Rebbe met Golda Meir, the history of Israel may have been very different. The Rebbe began to put all of his koyches into supporting the state, but not the philosophy, the people. Like the Rebbe once told somebody, after the Holocaust, if a Jew builds a community where Jews are able to protect themselves, you have to support it. It has nothing to do with religion. It's simply self-preservation. But the Rebbe, to this day, remains anti-Zionist. The Shita, that the preservation of the Jewish people comes from nationalism, is against our beliefs, because we are Chavre. Let's say it straight. We are an eternal people. That means we're here forever. There is no other nation that's eternal. You know, John Adams, the second president of the United States, wrote, we're not an eternal people. In other words, we're not the Jews. We are an eternal people. And what makes us eternal is not politics. What makes us a nation that in 500 years from today is still going to be here, whether the Western civilization will exist or not, whether America is going to be gone and Mexico is going to be gone or Canada, Jews are going to be here in 500 years from today. The eternity of the Jewish people is because of the eternity of the Jewish Torah. This is an undeniable fact. And that's the foundation of the position of the Rabbeim. Jews are not like other nations. We don't need to win the White House today. We need to be there when Mashiach comes, and we will. And the ones of us who will survive this incredibly long golus are those who hold on to Torah and mitzvahs. There are 15 or 16 million Jews in the world today. Probably 90% of them don't keep Yiddishkeit. If they live in Eretz Yisrael, they're protected by the fact that they're living amongst Jews. If they live in the diaspora, what's 7 out of 10 are marrying a goy? Jews are disappearing at an alarming rate, and some of them think that they're proud Jews. There is no such thing as a secular Jew. There's no such concept. It's an artificial creation, because a Jew is an eternal being, and the definition of secularism is evolution and change. Okay, we'll have Ma'ariv.